if severances are given to MPs to help them transition away from political life, then why are they getting this transition support slush fund on top of, they're quite generous $90,000 severance payments?
Hey, everyone. You're listening to the Canadian Taxpayers podcast. I'm Franco Terrazzano, the federal director here in Ottawa for your Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm joined by our investigative journalist, Ryan Thorpe. Ryan, now you've done some great digging already since you've joined the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, but maybe my favorite story is the one that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to be honest with our listeners. I wasn't even aware that this slush fund existed for former members of parliament. So why don't you break down what it is that you dug up?
Yeah, well, the basic news here is that ex-MPs are billing taxpayers for Ivy League educations. They're tapping into this little-known $15,000 slush fund that's officially called transition support. So since 2019, at least 12 ex-MPs, Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats across the board have tapped into this fund for education and professional development, expensing a total of $90,303 to taxpayers. So they use this money to go to schools that, quite frankly, most Canadians would have to be collegiate hockey stars to attend. We're talking Harvard, Cornell, both out of the US. We're talking about McGill, the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, the Institute for Corporate Directors. And just because other departing MPs didn't use this slush fund for education or training doesn't mean they weren't tapping into this $15,000 that's available to them for other purposes. So the $90,000 we're talking about, that's just to go attend, these Ivy League schools out of the US or these prestigious universities here in Canada.
Yeah, folks, former members of parliament getting to bill you to go to an Ivy League school. Must be nice, huh? Ryan, why don't you actually give us a little bit more details, though, on the slush fund itself?
Yeah, for sure. So the transition support, as they call it, this is the slush fund up to $15,000, and it's available for MPs who either lose re-election or who choose not to run again. So MPs must spend the transition support funding within 12 months of leaving office, although during the COVID-19 pandemic, they did extend that deadline for a number of MPs. The money can be used for, as I mentioned, education, professional development. They can also expense, office supplies, long distance phone calls, or up to 4 round trips within Canada. So, I think it's important to point out here, most Canadians can't get fired, right, and still bill their former bosses for an Ivy League education. Seems pretty basic, but that's what's going on here with these ex-MPs and this particular slush fund. And it's also worth pointing out that this is on top of a slew of other platinum perks and benefits and high pays that MPs are already getting.
Yeah. You say basic, but really it's pretty common sense that you shouldn't be able to leave your workplace and then bill your former employer for an Ivy League education. Now, folks, forgive Ryan. He's new to Ottawa, so he doesn't understand that common sense just isn't that common here in the nation's capital. Ryan, look, you pulled some pretty crazy examples of members of parliament tapping into the slush fund. So why don't you give the highlights to our listeners?
Yeah, for sure. So one that immediately comes to mind here is Matt DeCourcy. He's served as an MP for Fredericton from 2015 to 2019, so one term. He was defeated in the 2019 election, and then he walked away with a severance package that came in just shy of $90,000. So on top of that, he expensed $8,690 on courses from the McGill Executive Institute. And, this is billed as transition support. It's to help them land on their feet. But if you look at DeCourcy's resume, it looks like he had no trouble, landing on his feet after he left politics. He was appointed as a senior advisor to the federal minister of finance. In November 2020, he was named a fellow at the Pearson Center for Progressive Public Policy. And in December 2020, he landed a gig as a senior advisor to the president of the University of New Brunswick. But on top of, those gigs, apparently he also had to expense to taxpayers, a little bit under 10 grand to help with his professional development. Another case that I think is worth pointing out is Selena Caesar Chavanez. She left the Liberal caucus in 2019 and didn't seek re-election that year. She received a severance package, again, just shy of $90,000, but she also sent taxpayers a bill for $3,989 from the Chopra Center. And I had to look this up because I had never heard of this before. It's a wellness retreat and training center founded by the author Deepak Chopra. And one
Sounds
more here.
nice.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. One more here. We'll round it out with three. Brad Trost walked away with both a severance package and a pension. He also expensed the full 15 grand available to him to Harvard University.
Huh. Isn't that something? Okay. And, a couple of the examples that caught my eye were that you had these members of parliament. They then leave federal politics, and now they're ex-members of parliament. Then they tap into this transition support slush fund, and then they land right back into politics. Isn't that right?
Yeah, we did have a couple of cases like that. So one, Murray Rankin, he was a MP for Victoria from 2012 to 2019. He received a $34,000 annual pension after leaving federal politics. And in July 2019, he expensed the full $15,000 available to him in the slush fund to the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Shortly afterwards, in October 2022, Rankin was elected to the BC legislature, and he currently serves as the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. There's also Dan Rumi and Amarjeet Sohi, both former Liberal MPs. They expense taxpayers for a combined $15,483 in post-secondary education costs. And then right afterwards, they were elected mayor of Maple Ridge and Edmonton, respectively.
It's like you can't even make this stuff up, Now, one of the big issues with this, the obvious is that you have these members of parliament, former members of parliament, billing taxpayers for Ivy League education. But another big issue here is that this is just one platinum perk on top of a slew of other platinum perks that our members of parliament are billing us taxpayers for.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So for starters, the annual salary of a backbench MP in Canada right now is $194,600. So that's the bare minimum any MPs are going to be making. The Prime Minister receives a salary of $390,000. So if an MP serves less than 6 years in office, departing MPs receive half of their annual salary, so $97,300 as a severance payment. If they serve for more than 6 years, they're also eligible for a pension. So following the 2019 federal election, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation calculated the cost of severance and pension payments for departing MPs at $5.8 million and $104 million, respectively. In 2021, those figures were $3.3 million and $42 million. Now, remember, the severance is typically sold to Canadians as a way to help MPs, transition back to civic life. Quite frankly, I got to say, I don't buy that argument. But that's at least how it's sold to us. But on top of that $90,000 severance, they're also getting this $15,000 transition support slush fund. And it's worth pointing out, this appears to be unique in the Commonwealth. We looked at Britain, we looked at Australia, we looked at Scotland, we looked at Wales. We tried to find other countries in the Commonwealth that are comparable to Canada to see if they had this, and they don't.
So what's the fix? Like, what are we recommending? What's the solution here?
Well, I think, if severances are given to MPs to help them transition away from political life, then why are they getting this transition support slush fund on top of, they're quite generous $90,000 severance payments? Politicians' pays and perks, they need to be reined in. And I think completely scrapping this transition allowance slush fund is a pretty good place to start. As I mentioned, most Canadians can't get fired and still bill their former boss for an Ivy League education, and neither should Canadian MPs. So the other obvious place to start would be reversing the pay raises that MPs have been taking every year. MPs took 4 pay raises since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're now making about $15,700 and $31,400 more than they did before the pandemic. So the Harper government ended the automatic pay raises between 2010 and 2013. So we're calling on MPs to reverse the pay raises they gave themselves during COVID-19.
Ryan, I just want to point out, man, really good job here. And to all of our CTF supporters listening, if Ryan wasn't the one who dug this up, if our investigative shop didn't dig this up, I think almost no Canadian would even know that they're getting this sweetheart transition support slush fund, former ex-members of parliament, to bill taxpayers so they can go to Ivy League schools on top of a severance, on top of an overly generous base salary. So if our investigative team wasn't digging this up, I don't think really any Canadians would even know that this perk exists. It should not exist. And folks, if you want to learn a little bit more about this transition support slush fund, we'll link in our show notes to an article that the National Post did covering the work that Ryan uncovered.